Okay, Revelation chapter 12. We're going to read the whole chapter tonight, verses 1 through 18. Let me read this, and I'm reading from the New Revised Standard, the NRSV. A great portent appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pangs and the agony of giving birth. Then another portent appeared in heaven, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his heads. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. Then the dragon stood before the woman who was about to bear a child so that he might devour her child as soon as it was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was snatched away and taken to God and to his throne, and the woman fled into the wilderness where she has a place prepared by God, so that there she can be nourished for 1,260 days. And war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought back, but they were defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. The great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven proclaiming, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our comrades has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. But they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. For they did not cling to life, even in the face of death. Rejoice then, you heavens, and those who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you with great wrath, because he knows that his time is short." So when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given the 2 wings of the great eagle, so that she could fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to her place where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time. Then from his mouth the serpent poured water like a river after the woman, to sweep her away with the flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman. It opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from its mouth. Then the dragon was angry with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her children, those who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. Then the dragon took his stand on the sand of the seashore. This is the written word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Okay, well, what stands out? What are we reading here?
Stands out.
Dragons.
But the woman and the child had God's protection. One, that when the baby was born, it was swept up to heaven. 2, when she got the wings and the dragon had the water coming.
The woman and the child have God's protection. Yeah, the earth swallowed the flood. That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, that number is becoming familiar, isn't it? 1,260 days, which is what? 3.5 years. That we're becoming familiar with this whole 3.5 thing, aren't we? And it appears again when we read about the woman, right? A time, 2 times, and half a time, which is what? 3.5 times. So that 3.5 appears again. Those numbers are important. Anything else that's standing out in our initial reading?
I love the fact that the dragon, i.e. Satan, devil, just can't seem to win.
The devil, the dragon can't seem to win. Yeah. Yeah, and we'll talk about that a little bit. That's kind of the story of the second half of the book of Revelation. It's just that evil can't win. It just can't. And that's the story.
And that devil was angry, so he went after her children.
Yeah, the devil was angry and went after the children. Who are the children? We'll see that. Yeah. Who are the rest of her children? That's an important thing in this chapter. Well, I mean, there's a lot in this chapter. Things get really fun here, don't they? John's imagination is just going crazy, isn't it? Not in many other places do we read about dragons eating children. That's kind of unique to this chapter, isn't it? But you'll remember from 2 weeks ago that chapter 11 contained the revelation, right? Chapter 11 contained the revelation that we had so been longing for. It had taken so long. But the book, interestingly enough, it doesn't end at chapter 11. You might expect that okay, here's the revelation. This is the thing we've been waiting for. The seventh trumpet has blown. We might expect that would be the end of the story, but it's not. Chapter 12 begins what some call Act 2 of the book. So we jump into the second act of this great cosmic play, this great theater, if you will. It's very dramatic and theatrical, this story. So here we jump into the second half and the second act, if you will. The story will move on. The story will progress, but throughout the rest of the book of Revelation, we're going to be hearing a retelling of things we've already heard, with some advancements and some variations, because Revelation isn't linear, you'll remember. It's not a begin here, story progresses, and ends here. It's not a straight line story. It's there's this retelling or this recapitulation. The story it moves forward, but it kind of circles back on itself time and time again. And so we're going to see things that have been familiar. But the focus now shifts to the unfaithful, or to those powers, those forces that are working against God. From 12 to 22, one of the things that we will see, and that's very present in our passage today, is the demise of Satan and those forces that are working against God. Over the course of the next 11 chapters, Satan, or the Satan, will be cast out of heaven, and then will try to use his agents against the faithful, beasts and a harlot, but then will eventually be thrown into the abyss. And that will happen in chapter 22. So the second act, we see this steady demise of evil. Switching gears a little bit, that's an introduction into the second act of Revelation. But you all know the musical West Side Story, right? Do you guys remember the musical West Side Story? It was made popular in 1950s. You guys don't know West Side Story? When you're a jet all the way from your first cigarette to your last dying day. It's a musical in the 50s. Oh, man. It's a great musical. I was in West Side Story at Olivet. I played the character Action in West Side Story. Well, for those of you who do know West Side Story, what story is West Side Story retelling? Romeo and Juliet. It's a modern retelling of Shakespeare's classic, right? It's not the exact same story. You've got in Shakespeare, you've got the Capulets and the Montagues, right? But then in West Side Story, who do you have? You have the Jets and the Sharks, and the two young characters fall in love. They're not allowed to love each other, but they do. And then, it's the same story as Romeo and Juliet being told, only it uses the framework of Romeo and Juliet, but West Side Story, it tackles different issues than Romeo and Juliet. Uses the framework, but it tackles mid-20th century issues, immigration, racial issues. Those are all present within West Side Story. But it uses the framework, something that everybody knows. If you are familiar with Western literature, you know Romeo and Juliet. Well, something similar is happening in Revelation 12. In this chapter, those with even a general understanding of Greco-Roman mythology and literature would recognize the story we've just read. Tell me if this sounds a little bit familiar. There was a woman named Leto. She was a favorite lover of the god Zeus. Zeus's wife Hera, jealous of Leto, sends a dragon named Python to chase after Leto and Leto's child to kill them, because Leto had become pregnant by Zeus. In this pursuit, the north wind rescues Leto and baby by carrying them out to sea. It was there that Leto ended up giving birth to Artemis. And then, after 9 days of labor, she gives birth to another child named Apollo. 4 days after the birth of Apollo, he goes and kills the dragon that chased after his mother in order to avenge her. Does that sound familiar? Does that story sound like anything we might have read tonight? A pregnant woman chased by a dragon, rescued by the earth, and the child ends up slaying the dragon. Well, Roman emperors would use this story to their benefit. They would use it to promote themselves and their kingdoms. This story is a story of blatant good and evil. Who's good? Leto and the child. Who's evil? The dragon. Emperors would associate themselves as the god Apollo, who were able to usher in peace and prosperity, but they were defeating the dragon, whoever that dragon might be. Caesar Augustus was hailed as a new Apollo, for his reign was said to mark the beginning of a new golden age. Nero also likened himself as Apollo. If you look at the coins with Nero's impression on them, they have the signature radiant beams that belonged to Apollo. So Roman emperors would oftentimes use this myth to promote themselves and to propagate their roles as emperor. So those hearing Revelation for the first time, those listening to this chapter for the first time, who are living in a Greco-Roman world in Asia Minor. Remember, this letter circulated throughout Asia Minor, present-day Turkey, those 7 churches in a very Greco-Roman world. They would have heard this Roman myth in the background. They would have, oh yeah, that's Leto and Python. We know that story. Oh, that's Romeo and Juliet. Of course, everybody knows Romeo and Juliet, right? This would have played in their mind. When they hear Revelation 12, they think of, oh, Leto, Apollo, Python, of course. But John's telling is qualitatively different. It's not the same telling. It's not. We don't get the same message. Rather than the woman being a pagan goddess, what we're going to see tonight is that the woman is the people of God. The woman represents the people of God. And rather than the child being an emperor, because the emperors likened themselves to Apollo, rather than the child being born being the emperor, who is the child? The child is Christ, who will rule the nations with an iron rod. So this is just kind of background for Revelation chapter 12. This is what's going on. And this would have been in the imagination of the hearers. Only John uses this framework, uses this story that would have been so familiar to the hearers, but uses it for a different purpose. Much like West Side Story is a retelling of that great Shakespearean play, Romeo and Juliet. So going back to the text, listen again to verses 1 through 6 as we dive into this and kind of learn a little bit more about it. A great portent appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pangs and the agony of giving birth. Then another portent appeared in heaven, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his head. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. Then the dragon stood before the woman who was about to bear a child, so that he might devour her child as soon as it was born. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was snatched away and taken to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, so that there she can be nourished for 1,260 days. Okay, who was this woman? A great portent appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun. Who is this? We've kind of already addressed this. The people of God. Who do you think of when you hear of someone with a crown of 12 stars? What is that? Why a crown? Royalty. Who wears crowns? Royalty. Why 12 stars? 12 tribes. And what else? 12 disciples. This is representing, we'll see later on in the chapter more fully how this represents the people of God, but early on we have this indicator. Clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, there's this heavenly presence about her. And she is the faithful. She is the people of God. She was pregnant and crying out in birth pangs, in the agony of giving birth. She's in the midst of giving birth. And then all of a sudden in the heavens appears this red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems. Now there's a lot of speculation about what the 7 heads and the 10 horns represent. But this is basically a grotesque image that tells us something about those forces fighting against God. Why 7 heads? What does 7 represent? Do you remember? Perfection or fullness. What is this? This is perfect evil. This is the fullness of evil. This is the fullness of those forces going against God, those that we would call Satan or the devil. And why 7 diadems? What are diadems? Crowns. It's another word for crowns. Why 7 diadems? Because it seeks full power and full authority over the earth. It seeks to have this royal, imperial reign over the earth. So already in 3 verses, we see competing crowns, right? What is the woman wearing? A crown of 12 stars. And now this dragon appears, a great red dragon with 7 heads. And the 7 heads have what? Diadems, these crowns on his heads. So his tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. There's this great destruction associated with the dragon, right? This character is associated with destroying the heavenly realms at this point and threw them where? To the earth. Where is the heaven? Where is the dragon residing at this point? At this point, the dragon resides in heaven. A great portent appeared in heaven.
Oh, the woman was in heaven at that time.
The woman was in heaven at this time as well. So the dragon stood before the woman who was about to bear a child. And what is he doing? The dragon's just waiting there to do what? To eat the kid. I have this image of a dragon just like mouth agape, waiting for the birth, ready to consume a child as it exits the womb. I mean, this is bizarre imagery, isn't it? But then what happens? Well, hold on. As soon as it was born, one of the things, what's happening here? I mean, what is our reaction to this? Horror. Who's bad and who's good in this?
Right now, the book is good and the dragon's bad.
Obviously, the dragon is bad, right? I mean, this generates disgust for the dragon, and it generates sympathy for the woman and for the child. I mean, who eats a baby? Who seeks to consume a child the moment it is born? This pulls on kind of the disgust and the emotions of the readers and of the hearers. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all nations with a rod of iron. What does the dragon want above all else? What's the dragon's aim? To rule over all the earth. It seeks this total reign. What is this child going to do? The child will rule all nations. Why does the dragon want to consume the child? Because the child is a threat to the dragon. Because the dragon is seeking the thing that belongs to the child, rule over the earth. A rod of iron. Why a rod of iron? Strong? Absolutely. And there's an Old Testament reference here, as John typically does, right? He references the Old Testament over and over again. If you look back to Psalm 2, the second psalm, it reads, starting at verse 7, I will tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. So this is a reference back to the Psalms, who are describing who? Who are the Psalms looking forward to? Messiah, who is Christ. You know, what's interesting, some ancient Greek manuscripts, presumably some of the things that John of Patmos would have been reading, some of the Greek manuscripts read that this son will not, it's not that he will break them with a rod of iron. Some of the translations read that he will shepherd them with a rod of iron. So one commentator that I was reading wrote, it kind of depends on where you find yourself, whether the rod is doing the breaking or whether the rod is doing the shepherding. If you are in the faithful, then that rod is used for shepherding. If you are not, then perhaps it's not doing so much shepherding, but breaking. Yeah, Donna.
And the rod is strong. It's referring to God's strength.
Right, it's a rod of iron, not a rod of wood. Right. The rod does the breaking. The rod doesn't break, right? Absolutely, this indicates the strength of the child. But her child was snatched away and taken to God and to his throne. How was the child snatched away? We're not exactly told here. Presumably, God snatched the child and taken to God. How was it taken, though? It's not told here, but we know. He ascended and Christ ascended, but what happened before that? Christ was snatched away through crucifixion and resurrection. This is a nod here to the resurrection and to the ascension. This story jumps right from incarnation, the child was born, and goes right to the resurrection and taken to God and then taken to his throne, to the ascension. This doesn't necessarily neglect the crucifixion. We don't read in here that the child was killed and then resurrected and then taken to heaven, because the readers know that Christ was crucified. The point of this part of the story is to indicate that evil could not overcome Christ. No matter what evil tried to do, Christ is victorious. The child was snatched away and taken to God and to the throne. And the woman went where? In the desert, into the wilderness. This sounded like anything else you've heard of? The Exodus. And we'll talk about this more fully once we come back to the woman. There's going to be a bit of an interlude in the story here, and then we'll come back to the woman. She goes to the wilderness where she has a place prepared by God so that there she can be nourished for how long? For a while. That might be a good translation of it. For a while. For a season. For a short while. 3.5 years. A short while. Not forever. And then beginning at verse 7, and war broke out in heaven. All of a sudden we see this new character. Who? Michael. Who is Michael? And what is he doing? Archangel. The Archangel Michael is a biblical and non-biblical figure. There's a lot written about Michael that is not contained within our scriptures. If you look back at ancient Jewish, what are called extra-canonical texts that are not in the canon of the Bible, if you look at those extra-canonical texts, Michael's all over the place. Michael is the ancient prince who defeats the powers that oppose Israel. And that's written in Daniel chapter 10. Verses 13 and 21. You can read about that there. Daniel is the heavenly protector of God's people, according to Daniel chapter 12, and opponent of the devil, according to Jude 9. Michael appears as one who is a protector of the heavenly dwelling place and one who is a direct opponent of the devil. So that's Michael's role in the other books of the Bible, and his role is still, that's how he functions here in Revelation chapter 12. What is he doing? He's fighting the dragon. In order to do what? To protect the heavenly places. The dragon and his angels fought back, but they were defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. What happens to the dragon? Where is the dragon now residing? No longer in heaven. It's no longer in heaven. We're not told yet where he is thrown to, but we know it's no longer in heaven. That great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent. And here we see the identity. Who is this dragon? The devil and the Satan. The deceiver of the whole world. Thrown down where? To the earth. And his angels were thrown down with him. Prior to this, we saw that the dragon, who's called the devil, and Satan was able to act where? Prior to this, where was the devil working? In heaven. In heaven and on earth. Because what does it say? The deceiver of the whole world. So there are cosmic and earthly implications for this devil's act. Where is this one able to act now? only on earth, no longer in heaven. This is a great limiting of the scope of the devil's ability. The devil's ability, the dragon's abilities have been limited because of the child. It has been because of the war that has broken out, because the dragon pursued this child and failed. The dragon's abilities are limited. And at this point, it's worth noting, this is one thing that's really interesting. It's worth noting that the Old Testament concepts of Satan aren't that Satan is the author of evil, or even that Satan is necessarily contrary to God, if you would believe that. The Old Testament narratives, the Old Testament doesn't have kind of this unilateral understanding of who the devil is. The Hebrew word Satan, it means adversary. That's what Satan means, adversary. And the Old Testament pictures Satan as a member of God's heavenly court who accused people of sin. And we'll see later on that the devil is called the one who accuses people. For example, God considered Job to be righteous, but Satan insisted that Job was not truly good. In the first and second chapters of the book of Job, you can read about that. God and Satan and Job aren't against each other. It's that Satan is Satan is a presence of this heavenly council. And then similarly, Zechariah saw a vision in which a high priest appeared in filthy clothing, and Satan stood by to denounce him. But God refused to heed Satan and took away the priest's guilt, clothing him with festive garments instead. So here in Revelation announces that all the people of God are priests who have been cleansed by the blood of the Lamb from chapter 7, so that they can be clothed in white garments. So Satan historically and within the biblical narrative, it develops and it moves. Job, if you don't know, is considered the oldest book of the Bible, written first. It was the first of all of the canon. And it has this picture of the accuser being a member of the heavenly court, accusing people for heaven's sake and revealing sin, this necessary role for the heavenly court to have. But God chooses not to listen to the accuser. And throughout time, we have this development of this one as the devil, who becomes contrary to God. And so then in verse 10, this continues on. This one who has been the accuser, who has had a place in the heavenly court, who has been able to work in heaven and on earth, now has been thrown out of heaven. No longer does the dragon, no longer does the Satan, the accuser, no longer does this one hold any seats in the heavenly council. No longer is there any heavenly authority given to this one. And like ancient Greek plays, there were these choruses that would tell of what had happened in the play. Here we have this loud voice in heaven proclaiming, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our comrades has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God." You see, the one who previously sat in the heavenly court as the accuser no longer holds that position. There is no longer one accusing the saints in the heavenly realms. No longer is there one accusing humanity. No longer is there one who is saying, Job is unfaithful to God. No longer is there one who is saying, these saints aren't really saints. That the accusing role has been taken out. But they have conquered him by what? They have conquered. Who are they? Our comrades who have been thrown down. The saints, the faithful. They have conquered him. How? By the blood of the Lamb. And how? By the word of their testimony. How is Satan conquered? Faithfulness. By the blood of the Lamb, by faithfulness. The faithfulness of Christ, and therefore the faithfulness of the saints. What is the word of their testimony? What do they testify to? Christ. They testify of the resurrection, of the blood of the Lamb. For they did not cling to life even in the face of death. What is this talking about? Martyrs. This is specifically referencing martyrdom. So often the world thinks that the death of the faithful is in some way a defeat of Christianity or Jesus. But this couldn't be further from the truth. People think that when Christians are killed, that their authority or their influence is taken away. But that's not the case. Have you heard about the Catholic priest in northern France? Just a few weeks ago, there was a Catholic priest, 2 nuns, and 2 parishioners who were celebrating Mass. 5 people that were celebrating Mass together. And a terrorist came in, and I believe 2 survived, but the priest had his throat cut in the middle of celebrating Mass. And already, this priest is being celebrated. His faithfulness is being celebrated. The martyrdom of Christianity does the exact opposite of its intended effect. Because this is how Christ conquered. Through the giving of his life, through the shedding of his blood. This doesn't mean we celebrate martyrdom. This doesn't mean we celebrate persecution or we desire the death of other Christians. But it does mean that we don't lose ourselves, because in martyrdom, the dragon is defeated, because this is how Christ conquered. And so they did not cling to life even in the face of death. Why? Because that's how Christ lived. And what's the next word in verse 12? Okay, therefore what? Rejoice. Rejoice then, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. Why did the heavens rejoice? Because the accuser has been thrown down. Because the devil no longer resides in the heavenly realms. Oh, but then there's that next line. But woe to you, woe to the earth and to the sea. The earth and the sea have woe. Why? Because now Satan has a presence where? On earth. And we'll see later on in the story in the sea. This is the last bastion of the devil's grasp. And guess what? What does it say? He knows it. He knows that his time is short. This is the last, this is it. This is all the devil has left. But it's only for a time. He will eventually, what we'll see later on, this is a spoiler alert, just letting you know there's something coming ahead. He's going to be cast into the abyss. What we're reading here is the descent of the Satan from the heavenly realms to the abyss. So first, he's cast out of heaven. Next, what we're going to see is that he'll be cast into the abyss. From an earthly perspective, evil can seem so pervasive as to be unstoppable. And I think we're really feeling this right now. I think we're seeing in some keen ways, it seems like evil is unstoppable. Where the wicked prosper and the righteous suffer, the devil seems to reign. From a heavenly perspective, however, evil rages on earth not because it is so powerful, but evil rages on earth because it is so vulnerable. Craig Keister, a commentator, someone I referenced a lot for tonight's study, he likens the devil being thrown out of heaven like a wild animal thrashing about who's just been caged. You take away the place where this wild thing has resided for so long and you cage him up, and what happens? It goes crazy. So this is kind of what we're seeing. The dragon, is the Satan, the accuser, no longer sits in the heavenly realms, no longer has a seat in the heavenly court, and is cast down to this earth, and it just goes wild. It's a last-ditch effort. I mean, when you watch sporting events, like in soccer or in hockey, hockey might be more appropriate for a Michigan group, right? Hockey or soccer, both of these sports, if a team's down at the end of the game, especially in hockey, if it's in the third period, you've got 2 minutes left and you're down by 1 goal, what do? You pull the goalie and you add an extra player on the court, on the rink in hockey. And you go crazy to do whatever you can. You do whatever you can in the last few minutes of the game to get one more goal, to tie it up, to go into overtime. And you make yourself vulnerable. What happens in hockey as often as a team scoring, probably more than not, is the team that has the lead, they have an open goal on the other end, and so they can just put it in the net from the opposite end of the rink. It leaves the team vulnerable. Well, this is what's going on here. The fact that evil is thrashing about is not indicative of its power. It's indicative of its vulnerability and its very near demise. That's what's going on. Moving on to verse 13. So when the dragon saw that he'd been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. No longer does he go after the child. Who does he go after now? The woman. But the woman was given the 2 wings of the great eagle so that she could fly from the serpent into the wilderness. What does this sound like? Fleeing from an aggressive pursuer into the wilderness. Does that sound like another story you've heard? Children of Israel, the Exodus. What's different here, though, is what happens to protect the Israelites in their flight to the wilderness? What do they pass through? The Red Sea. The waters are divided, and they walk on dry ground. In this story, waters are pursuing them, and the earth responds not by separating the waters, but by separating the earth. And the earth consumes the water to protect the woman. So it's kind of a reversal of that story. But she could fly into the wilderness to her place where she is nourished for how long? A while. For a season, for a bit, a short period. Then from his mouth the serpent poured water like a river after the woman to sweep her away with the flood. But who came to the help of the woman? The earth. The earth came to the help of the woman. Now this is similar to the story of Leto and Apollo, because if you remember in that retelling, what came to the rescue of Leto? It was the north wind. The wind carried her. And where does she go? The woman was given what? Wings, and was carried away and was protected by the earth. Creation is on the side of God. Creation is on the side of the faithful. The creation and the creator are not at odds with one another. What did God say when God created? This is good. This is good. Creation seeks to protect the faithful. Because remember, the woman here represents the people of God. Creation seeks to protect the faithful as the faithful seek to protect creation. Do you remember what we read 2 weeks ago in Revelation chapter 11? Remember what the last line of chapter 11 was? Or not the last one, verse 18 there? The nations raged, but your wrath has come in the time for judging the dead, for rewarding your servants, the prophets and saints, and all who fear your name, both small and great, and for destroying those who destroy the earth. Well, what's happening in the very next chapter? The earth is coming to the rescue of the faithful. There's this mutual loving relationship between creation and steward of creation, the faithful. So what does the earth do? There's this personification here. The earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. So the dragon can rage on the earth, but guess what? The earth can rage back. The earth can counter the dragon. Then the dragon was angry with the woman and went to do what? The dragon gave up pursuing the woman and instead set its sights on whom? The rest of her children. Which are who? Those who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. Now, who's that? Oh, we've already said it. It's the faithful Christians. Us. Who are these other children? They're all the faithful. The woman encompasses the story of Israel, from whom the Messiah was born. That's what we read earlier on. The woman was pregnant. Who did Christ come through? Who was Christ born into? Israel. As well as the story of the church, who was persecuted after Jesus' death and resurrection. In the last chapter, the people of God were likened to a temple. Here, the people of God are likened to a woman who will be preserved for how long? A while. For a time, 2 times, and half a time. For a season. Then the dragon was angry with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her children, those who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. And believe it or not, this is good news. The fact that the dragon makes war on the children indicates what? That he's losing. That he doesn't have the authority and the power that he once had. He's on his way out. So he goes after the weak and the vulnerable. And then in 18 it says, then the dragon took his stand on the sand of the seashore. This is a bit of setting us up for what's to come. We're going to see that once the dragon fails, he's going to send his agents on his behalf. And we're going to see that the seashore is an important place for that. And one thing before we close or go to questions or clarifications is that this story isn't the popularized story of the devil being cast out of heaven, is it? This isn't a before creation there was a war in heaven and the devil was cast out and then the devil created evil on earth. When is this taking place? It did happen, it is happening, and it will happen. It's not that the devil was cast out of heaven before time. It's that the devil lost his authority with the resurrection of Christ. The devil thought that killing Christ would be the final blow for the faithful, but it ended up being the opposite. It was the deciding factor in the demise of evil. And so now where do we find ourselves? On what side of history do we find ourselves? When the devil is on its way out. This is a good word. This is good news. And it's not the popularized notion where evil has as much authority as good. That's not what we believe. Evil is not as powerful as Christ. Because what happens in this story? Every time the dragon goes after the faithful, what happens? He's thwarted. He loses. And that's what happens. And that's what will happen. This is good news. And so this story, chapter 12, for all of its imagination, it's a story that was told in familiar language to listeners, that they should not lose heart because the accuser has been thrown out of heaven and is taking his final stand. The fact that there might be these outbursts indicates that the devil is on his last leg. The fact that the devil is thrashing about, going after the children of the faithful, indicates that he's vulnerable. He's leaving his goal empty so that he can have this last-ditch effort in the last few minutes to try and figure something out, but it's not going to work. Every time the dragon tries to attack, he'll be thwarted. And we're going to see that throughout the rest of the book. What we're reading is the demise of evil. And this is good news. This is hopeful. This is something we like to hear. So this is what's going on in chapter 12, and it's kind of bizarre for our ears. A dragon getting ready to consume a newly born child, and a dragon that doesn't breathe fire but breathes water that is then eaten by the earth. This is really imaginative language, but it's told in such a way that the readers would be encouraged, not discouraged. And so often we avoid this book because we think it's scary or discouraging, but it's not. It's so good and it's so hope-filled. Revelation is, I've said this before, other than the Gospels that contain the resurrection, I believe Revelation is the most hope-filled book of the New Testament. There's so much hope here. It's not bad news. It's not doom and gloom. It's victory. It's good.